I use a phrase with patients that tends to land. Opioid bankruptcy. Bankruptcy is not the same as spending too much. Bankruptcy is what happens when income collapses at the same time as expenses rise. Two things going wrong at once, from opposite directions, until the account cannot be balanced. That is what long-term opioid therapy can do to your pain control system. This is how we explain it to patients on our website, and it is worth quoting exactly. It is the account running dry from both ends. On one side, escalating opioid doses drive tolerance as the nervous system adapts. On the other, your body has its own internal opioid system, natural pain-relieving chemicals it makes on its own, and disrupted sleep and circadian misalignment impair that system and lower your overall pain threshold. So the external supply loses power while the internal supply is being depleted. Let me take those two sides one at a time. This side is not controversial. Give the nervous system a narcotic and it begins adapting immediately. Receptors desensitize. Signaling downregulates. The same dose does less. And again, in our own words to patients, because the nervous system is extraordinarily adaptive. Give it a narcotic and it begins adapting immediately, so the dose has to climb to achieve the same effect. That escalation is not a sign of weakness or drug seeking. It is predictable neurobiology. Predictable neurobiology, not character. This side is the one almost nobody explains to patients, and it is where the word bankruptcy earns its keep. You are not a passive recipient of pain relief. You manufacture your own. Your body produces endorphins and enkephalins, endogenous opioids, and they are a major part of why you are not in agony all the time. That system is what lets you finish a hard workout or absorb a minor injury and carry on. Chronic external opioid exposure suppresses your internal machinery. And here the evidence is genuinely strong because it has been measured in the endocrine system. Vuong and colleagues published a comprehensive review in Endocrine Reviews in 2010 on the effects of opioids on animal and human endocrine systems. Chronic opioid therapy suppresses the hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis. It has a clinical name, opioid-induced androgen deficiency, reviewed by Smith and Elliott in Pain Physician in 2012, and by Antony and colleagues in 2020. Amini Lari and colleagues published a systematic review in Pain Medicine in 2019 on hormone replacement and tapering for opioid-induced hypogonadism. So this is not speculative. Long-term opioids measurably suppress endogenous hormonal signaling. Low testosterone, fatigue, low mood, low libido, poor recovery. Those are not incidental. They are part of the same picture. Then add sleep, which is where the account really drains. Deep sleep is when your body recharges its own pain control systems. Krauss and colleagues, working in Matthew Walker's lab, published a study in the Journal of Neuroscience in 2019 called The Pain of Sleep Loss. They showed that sleep deprivation amplifies pain reactivity in the brain's sensory regions while blunting the circuits that normally modulate and dampen that signal. One bad night measurably lowers your pain threshold the next day. Now stack it. Suppressed endogenous opioid and hormonal signaling, disrupted sleep, circadian misalignment. Meanwhile, the external drug is losing potency and the dose is climbing. Income down, expenses up, bankruptcy. I want to be straight with you about the limits of this model because I would rather you trust me than be impressed by me. Opioid bankruptcy is a clinical framework I use to describe two documented processes happening together. It is not a single proven mechanism with one lab test. In fact, one careful experimental study, Chu and colleagues in the Journal of Pain in 2011, found that the endogenous opioid system did not appear to mediate opioid-induced hyperalgesia specifically. So the mechanisms are separable and the science is still being worked out. What is not in doubt? Tolerance is real. Endocrine suppression is real. Sleep loss lowering pain threshold is real. Whether you call the combination bankruptcy is a matter of language. Whether it is happening is not. Here is a consequence patients almost never get told about. Your endogenous opioid system does not only handle pain, it handles pleasure, specifically the liking of things. Barrage and colleagues at Michigan mapped what they call hedonic hotspots, brain regions where mu opioid signaling directly amplifies how pleasurable something feels. Castro and Barrage published work in PNAS in 2017 identifying opioid hedonic hotspots in the orbitofrontal cortex and insula. That is animal work, and I flag it as such, but it establishes the principle. Mu opioid signaling is a pleasure amplification system, not just an analgesic one. Now suppress that system with chronic external opioids. Baseline pleasure flattens, and the body looks for something that still works. Food works. Highly palatable, refined, industrially engineered food works quickly and reliably. I call this hedonic substitution, and I see it constantly. A patient on long-term opioids who is gaining weight and cannot understand why, being told they lack discipline. They do not lack discipline. Their reward system has been chemically flattened, and food is the most available lever left. And then the weight gain drives more metabolic inflammation, which drives more pain. Another loop closes. This brings me to the thing I most want to change in how we talk about this. We treat addiction as though it were purely a matter of exposure, as though the molecule reliably produces the disease, and the only variable is how much you were given. That model is why the national response was to reduce prescriptions and expect the crisis to resolve. It did not resolve. The exposure model is contradicted by one of the best natural experiments in the history of addiction medicine. In 1971, President Nixon declared drug abuse the nation's #1 public health problem. There was a specific reason for the alarm: heroin use among American soldiers in Vietnam. Enlisted men were returning from a war zone where cheap, extraordinarily pure heroin was widely available. Soldiers were screened by urine test before being allowed to fly home, and those who tested positive were detoxified first. The expectation, the near universal medical expectation at the time, was catastrophe. Addiction was understood as permanent. A generation of veterans was assumed to be lost. Lee Robbins, an epidemiologist at Washington University here in St. Louis, was funded by the Department of Defense, the National Institutes of Health, and the Veterans Administration to actually follow these men. She started in September 1971 and tracked them after they came home. Roughly 20% of enlisted men had become addicted to opioids while in Vietnam. And then they returned to the United States. In the first year home, only about 5% had relapsed into addiction. After 3 years, about 12%. Read that again. 80 to 90% of genuinely addicted men, most of whom received no treatment at all, simply did not resume. Robbins published her reflections in the journal Addiction in 1993, asking whether the Vietnam recovery was a fluke or a normal expectation. It was not a fluke. It was a change of context. The molecule did not change. The environment did. The cues, the stress, the availability, the peer group, the absence of purpose, the war. Remove the terrain that sustained the behavior, and the behavior largely dissolved. And we have a second, more painful piece of evidence, which is the last 20 years of American policy. If addiction were simply a function of prescription exposure, then reducing prescriptions should have reduced deaths. Prescribing has fallen substantially since 2012. Overdose deaths did not fall. They climbed, driven increasingly by illicit synthetic opioids. That is what happens when you treat a social and metabolic problem as a supply problem. You constrict the supply, you leave the terrain untouched, and people move to something more dangerous. Meanwhile, a large group of legitimate pain patients, people who were stable, functional, and compliant, get caught in the correction. That is why most of the patients referred to me now arrive undertreated rather than overtreated. Volkow, Koob, and McClellan laid out the modern version of this in the New England Journal of Medicine in 2016. A brain disease model that explicitly incorporates social and environmental determinants rather than treating exposure as destiny, which is why when I ask you about your sleep, your food, your work, your housing, and who is at home, I am not making small talk. I am asking about the terrain that will determine whether you recover. Rebuilding the internal system is most of what we actually do. Protect deep sleep and fix circadian misalignment. Eat whole food with adequate protein and healthy fat, and get off the refined carbohydrate and industrial seed oils that drive inflammation. Move. Physical activity restores endogenous opioid signaling. Treat the structural pain generator directly so the medication has less work to do. address the psychological and social load with real support, then reduce the external supply slowly as the internal supply comes back online. Never on your own and never on an arbitrary schedule. You are not bankrupt permanently. Accounts can be rebuilt. That is the short version. If you want the full mechanism, what happens at the receptor, why the gate stays open, and the peer-reviewed sources behind all of it, I recorded a scientific masterclass called Endorphin Bankruptcy, Why Opioids Fail. It is linked below this video, and every citation is on screen at the end of it. Padda Institute, 4477 Woodson Road, Suite 100, St. Louis. Call 314-481-5000 or text 314-886-5902.